On Sundays, Macon County is a chorus hymns rising through longleaf pines. Children in pressed shirts, mothers smoothing ribbons at the nape of the neck. The Tuskegee Institute stands on the hill, a testament to learning, and black ambition hope set in brick. In kitchens, women stretch flour and faith. In fields, men negotiate harvests against debt tallies that never quite clear. Health care is scarce money scarcer. A promise of tests, a hot meal, a ride to the clinic, these are not luxuries. They are lifelines. The system notices this need. Jim Crow keeps wages low, hospitals segregated, and skepticism high. In that tension, the study presents itself as charity. It offers certainty in a world engineered to deny it. The intake forms look like protection. The exam table looks like progress. Yet the normal here is brittle, held together by church committees and neighborly watchfulness. One warning circulates in the pews, read what you sign. Another warning, older than paperwork, circulates in whispers, free things can be expensive. The tragedy is not hidden in a back alley. It is arranged in daylight appointments, kept notes taken, follow-ups scheduled. The men trust because they must. The institutions receive that trust and convert it into data. On the surface, this is care. Underneath it is calculus. And it is about to run for decades. If you believe history must be faced, not avoided, stay with us. We'll trace the timeline, decode the classified language, and show how an investigation became a long, gruesome violation of consent. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what did you learn or hear in your family about Tuskegee? Your reflections help surface the voices the file cabinets left out. And if you value Black history told with documents, not hype, tap subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Before a letter promising free treatment ever landed on a kitchen table in Macon County, the scaffolding for harm had been erected in policy custom and budget lines. American medicine in the early 20th century did not operate on a level field. It ran on a gradient carefully engineered by law and habit. Hospitals segregated by race. Public clinics that opened to some towns, but not others. Charity wards that documented generosity while rationing care. The language of efficiency and public interest became a veil that hid the arithmetic of exclusion. In this environment, Black illness was too often treated as a moral or racial defect, rather than a predictable consequence of poverty, tenant farming, and environmental exposure. Hookworm and malnutrition could be mapped onto soils and wages, but the discourse chose to map them onto bodies. Research protocols drifted toward observation when resources for cure were scarce, observation dressed as scientific virtue, a disturbing sleight of hand that rebranded absence as rigor. That drift was not neutral. It was pushed by the belief that data extracted from Black suffering could be harvested at a lower ethical price. County systems conspired in ordinary ways. A sheriff facilitated transport for special examination days, believing this was public service. A judge praised health surveys from the bench. A school board invited a lecture on rural disease without asking what would follow diagnosis. Newspapers published short, confident items about advances in understanding bad blood, leaving readers with the impression that attention equaled improvement. And because the Tuskegee Institute's prestige lent borrowed trust to visiting officials, consent could be assumed where it had not been meaningfully asked. Budgets mattered. When money tightens, administrators grow fluent in the vocabulary of triage. Cures cost, clipboards don't. A single vial of penicillin could disrupt a dataset built on natural history. If your goal is knowledge purchased cheaply, the classified preference becomes clear. Prioritize continuity of the cohort over the interruption of cure. It is a dark calculus, macabre, precisely because it is bureaucratic, rather than theatrical committee minutes, procurement forms, and study renewals that preserve the project through wars, elections, and shifting tides of public rhetoric. The medical curriculum of the era offered additional cover. Courses praised objectivity as the highest virtue. Students learned to describe lesions with cool precision. Precision is necessary, but when not tethered to ethics, it can become a tool of erasure. A sentence like defer treatment to avoid contaminating the sample sounds technical, even tidy. It is in reality a policy decision about whose pain is instrumental. The unspeakable hides not in what is shouted, but in what is quietly normalized. Jim Crow was more than signs on doors. It was a system that allocated risk and benefit by race. Black communities paid a premium in exposure to disease and a penalty in access to care. In that structure, trust became a currency constantly devalued by experience. Yet necessity forced people to transact anyway. When federal doctors arrived under a banner of help, many men and their families made a rational choice. Within irrational constraints, accept the ride, take the meal, sign the form. The study exploited that rationality. It was designed to. By mid-century, the appearance of penicillin should have triggered an immediate pivot from observation to treatment. That is what a health system organized around care would do. Instead, the study's managers triaged ethics the way a business triages costs, protecting the continuity of an experiment that had outlived its moral license. To call this a product of its time is to ignore the contemporaries who objected, the nurses who hesitated, the families who asked hard questions in Sunday school basements. Dissent existed. The project simply learned how to outvote it. Thus, when we say Tuskegee was not an accident, we mean it was a programmed outcome of incentives, ideas, and inertia of a society that prized certain kinds of knowledge over certain kinds of people. The paperwork was not incidental. It was the instrument. The clinics were not neutral rooms. They were stages where policy performed itself as care. And the men, fathers, husbands, neighbors, were placed into roles written without their consent. Long before any headline, the community registered warnings in the language it trusted. A deacon dreamed of a bright hall that grew colder the longer he prayed inside it. A midwife said the nightbirds were talking too late in the season. A mother reading a letter with careful lips told her son, "If the paper is free, read it twice." These were not superstitions to the people who voiced them. They were instruments for forecasting danger when institutions refused to send honest weather reports. There were secular omens, two signs that anyone could see. A neighbor who returned from tests grew thinner but did not receive pills. A man who tried a different clinic was scolded to stay with the program and promised a ride next week. A nurse, kind but insistent, reminded families of burial insurance tied to continued participation. The logic of help sounded inverted in the kitchen light. Why would treatment be delayed if the disease was known? Why were the most eager visitors the ones with clipboards rather than medicines? Pastors preached vigilance without naming names. Steward your body as a temple, read your covenants. Choir mothers whispered that paperwork comes with shadows. At fish fries and quilting circles, women compiled practical epidemiology: who was sicker, who was traveling more often, which questions the examiners asked. It was an archive of care kept in memory because official ledgers wouldn't hold it. In those murmurs lay a final warning. Harm often arrives politely with schedules and thank yous. The men heard the warnings. Most did not ignore them. They weighed them against hunger, against a tractor payment, against a daughter needing shoes for school. They weighed them against the status of the institute on the hill and the authority of federal seals. When tomorrow is pressing down, a free ride today is difficult to refuse. That is not foolishness. It is arithmetic in a world designed to produce desperate math. And so the community stepped forward, not because it believed in banned miracles, but because it believed in survival. The study counted on that belief. It learned to speak softly in public and firmly in halls where decisions were made. The omens did not fail. They were outvoted by necessity. What followed would show how a nation turns folk wisdom into rumor and anonymous memos into policy. The room grows colder as the deacon dreamed not by accident, but by design. The study accelerates not with sirens, but with stationery. Appointment cards multiply. Special days are announced through pastors and county nurses. Men line up in shirts bleached by sun and lie, holding the kind of hope that looks practical. Maybe this will make the headaches stop. Intake rooms hum with a routine that feels like care scales. Thermometers, quiet questions, the careful tap of a typewriter. Yet inside the classified files, a different cadence rules. The phrases repeat with the cold certainty of a stamp, non-therapeutic, retain follow to endpoint. The breakpoint arrives in stages. First, a discovery, a new drug, penicillin, proves remarkably effective against syphilis. Medical journals buzz, training lectures update, hospital formularies adjust. In a clinic organized around healing, the news would trigger a race to treat. Here the race is to preserve a data set. Memoranda surface that weigh the risk of contamination if participants receive penicillin elsewhere. Risk in this context means men getting well. Contamination means the study losing its purity. The words are disturbing not because they are lurid, but because they are tidy. Second, an external doctor unaffiliated offers treatment to a participant who shows up at his door. The man returns to Tuskegee and, according to later recollections, is told to stay with the program because the institute knows his case best. A county nurse reminds him of burial insurance and rides. The message is, consistency saves you. Deviation endangers you. He signs the next card, not because he trusts the science, but because he trusts the local network that has steered him through droughts and debts. Meaningful consent dissolves under the weight of dependency. Third, the study hardens its logistics. Lists circulate of men to find when they migrate for seasonal work. Letters are drafted to military induction boards so that if a participant is called up and evaluated, the armed forces medical machine does not automatically treat him with penicillin. Coordination of this kind, across agencies, across years, signals intent. It is not neglect, it is design. The unspeakable emerges in the interoffice tone, courteous, precise, indifferent to the moral shock outside the page. There are moments when the choreography falters. A nurse respected in 3 churches tells a supervisor that a participant's wife is ill and begs for treatment. The reply arrives with polite regret and the assurance that protocols will be reviewed. A young public health employee, mid-pay grade, writes a note asking whether the penicillin era requires a wholesale reevaluation of purpose. His query is filed not answered. The machine absorbs objections the way a river absorbs pebbles. Meanwhile, the men age inside the experiment. Their bodies become calendars, joints stiffen, eyes worry. Spouses become private statisticians, counting the distance between appointments and the number of times the word cure appears rarely, if ever. The study's managers praise follow-up rates and consistency across decades, as if endurance itself were evidence of ethical soundness. What the numbers do not show is the maintenance cost paid in trust to family arguments over whether to keep going. Prayers that sound like negotiations, quiet resignations, framed as strength. When you compress these years into a single breath, the betrayal emerges with a clarity that can feel like rage once an effective treatment existed. Observation without offering care became a choice. The actors involved were not nameless. The paperwork preserves their names. The county offices, the institute halls, the federal letterheads, none of them shouted. They simply agreed over and over that continuity mattered more than cure. That agreement is the breakpoint. It transforms a bad idea into a macabre institution. Every system that harms quietly cultivates a shadow archive, voices that witness record and are then set aside. In Tuskegee, those voices include the nurse who keeps a private notebook of conversations that felt wrong, the janitor who collects discarded carbons with phrases he can't stop reading, the deacon who counsels young men and notices a pattern of promises without prescriptions, Their testimonies do not enter the official minutes because they are not invited to speak in rooms where minutes are made. There are documents, too, that blink in and out of existence. A family retains a letter advising continued observation, but years later cannot find the envelope when a reporter asks. A widow preserves a death certificate that lists causes in clinical order and wonders why no one wrote the simplest truth that there was help and it was withheld. A pastor's widow keeps a ledger of benevolence funds used to cover transport to appointments. It does not say study, it says help with ride. Her careful script is an indictment only because the larger story exists. The banned testimony is not exotic or paranormal. It is ordinary speech excluded by process. In church kitchens, women share a kind of epidemiology, which questions the examiners asked. This time whether anyone mentioned medicine by name, who came home with bandages and who came home with words. They do not say protocol. They say pattern. They do not say non-therapeutic. They say they watched. The difference is not just vocabulary, it is perspective. One asks what the study needs. The other asks what a family needs. Attempts to surface these voices meet familiar obstacles. Reporters, when they finally arrive, are routed toward official spokespeople who offer context. The context is thick with euphemism standards of the day, evolving ethics, misunderstanding. Files are misplaced, then located, then released with redactions that drain urgency from the page. Oversight committees convene and issue conclusions that carefully avoid the word most apt for actions taken after penicillin refusal. The record is not burned. It is sorted until its edges are too neat to cut. Inside the institutions, a few insiders do speak. A memo emerges from a mid-level scientist expressing alarm that subjects are not being offered curative therapy. His language is restrained. The effect is not. But restraining language is easy to manage. Create a subcommittee study. The concern report that more study is needed. The machine does not punish him dramatically. It thanks him for his diligence and continues. Later, his file notes describe him as earnest, perhaps not fully apprised of complexities. That phrase does quiet work, devaluing conscience as naivete. Outside, a participant's daughter writes a letter to the editor after her father dies. She chooses plain diction, what he was told, what he was not given, what he feared to say. The paper runs it below the fold, opposite a column on county fairs. But the letter circulates in barbershops and beauty salons, where placement on the page matters less than resonance in the room. Memory begins to braid itself, a rumor corrected by a name anchored by a date matched with a paper clipped from the courthouse bulletin board. The braid is stronger than any single strand. When exposure finally arrives, pushed by public pressure, legal risk, and the simple exhaustion of excuses, it confirms what the shadow archive has long held. The study suppressed treatment to preserve observation. It coordinated with other agencies to prevent contamination by penicillin. It recorded decline as if decline were a gift to knowledge. The gruesome part is the elegance with which routine hid intent. Participants were not pursued with threats. They were pursued with politeness. Their consent was not torn. It was stretched until it no longer covered the act. Yet even in exposures, some testimonies remain missing. A nurse's notebook never surfaces. A janitor's carbons are thrown out during a renovation. A pastor's ledger is lost in a movie. The archive of harm is always incomplete because harm distributes the burden of proof to the harmed. This asymmetry is itself part of the design. A nation that wants to forget can point to gaps and call them doubt. A community that cannot forget points to scars and calls them history. So we assemble what we can. The memos that survive the letters families kept, the recollections that align across households and years. We refuse the temptation to dramatize what is already unspeakable in its restraint. We name the choices that converted care into calculus. And we carry forward the voices that were treated as noise against the signal, because in the honest archive, they are the signal. The next act will open the files in full light, not to shock, but to understand how line by line a macabre institution justified itself and why the nation allowed it to run for 40 years. The files open not with a bang, but with the click of a cabinet. Inside, carbon copies, referral lists, interoffice memos, whose restraint is their indictment. Non-therapeutic one-line repeats. Defer penicillin, another insists years after the drug changed the course of infectious disease. A third, maintain cohort integrity. The phrases look tidy until you translate them back into rooms where men sat on paper-covered tables and asked whether the headaches would stop. Investigators and journalists begin to reconstruct a timeline across decades. The frame widens church sign-up days, roundups of participants for special examinations, thank you notes to community leaders who facilitated cooperation, letters forwarded to draft boards and hospitals to avoid contamination by outside treatment. Each piece looks banal until you place it alongside the others. Then the picture coheres with disturbing clarity, an apparatus that required effort to maintain non-treatment. The harm, in other words, had managers. The record shows how the study survived changes in leadership. New directors arrived, praised continuity, and signed renewals. Ethics statements were updated in the abstract, while the data streams continued in the particular. A reviewer scrawled a question in the margin, "Is continued observation justified in the penicillin era?" And the reply, typed weeks later, invoked scientific value and logistical difficulty in locating former subjects once routines were altered. Scientific value replaced moral argument, the way a curtain replaces a wall. It concealed it did not bear weight. Photographs exist, but we will not show them here. Their captions, stage progression, neurologic sequelae, dermal manifestations are more chilling than any image because they normalize the view from above. We examine instead the paperwork. A scheduling sheet calculates travel times between farms, maximizing the number of follow-ups per day. A procurement log lists lumbar needles and film for x-rays. An expense report reimburses a meal for a community partner who helped re-enroll reluctant men. No single page is macabre, the system they assemble is. Families' artifacts add a human ledger. A church benevolence notebook that paid for gasoline to appointments. A widow's envelope of clippings and death certificates. A daughter's letter asking why her father was told to keep every appointment but never offered a named medicine. These are not counter records. They are the record placed next to official documents that pretended to be complete. When auditors compare counts, participants enrolled those lost to follow-up deaths, attributed to causes adjacent to the disease they encounter. Another layer, ripple effects, uncounted by design. Wives infected. Children born with complications. Communities that learned through lived statistics that health systems could use them as instruments. The official numbers acknowledge harm, the banned totals live, where policy rarely looks in the costs sworn by those who were never on the roster. The gruesome revelation here is not gore. It is the logic laid bare once cure became available. Non-treatment demanded coordination. Somebody called, somebody filed, somebody renewed a grant, somebody wrote to another agency to stall an antibiotic. The chain of ordinary actions is the horror. If you seek villains, you will find names. If you seek the enabler, you will find a procedure. By the time the public sees the puzzle assembled, denial has few rooms left to occupy. Administrators concede errors of judgment. Spokespeople speak of standards of the time. But the memos carry dates that outlast those excuses. And the families standing in their Sunday clothes under the unblinking sun do not speak of standards. They speak of promises. Why did this persist? And why did the truth live so long behind classified phrasing and polite minutes? The motives are layered. First, economics. Treatment for all requires budgets, logistics, and political will. Observation produces papers at a lower cash cost. When money is tight, institutions sometimes mistake thrift for virtue. In that calculus, the cheapest thing watching masquerades as the most scientific. The ledger hides what it does not price: pain, funerals, fear. Second, white supremacy. A society that ranks lives by race can label the sacrifice of black health as data without triggering its own alarms. Stereotypes about non-compliant patients and natural disease courses provided a story that excused withholding cure. Racism did not merely bias the study. It animated the premise that certain bodies could be conscripted into risk for the putative good of all. Third, institutional inertia. Once a project acquires prestige and a paper trail, it defends itself. Directors inherit not just files, but loyalties. Review committees frame questions that protect the shape of the answer. Was the consent form signed instead of the ethical core? Was choice meaningful? Bureaucracies are skilled at converting moral crises into administrative tasks. The study outlived outrage by distributing it across meetings that ran on time. How was it erased? Not only by shredders and fires, though documents do go missing, but by euphemism and gatekeeping. Minutes describe deception as methodological necessity. Reports redefined withholding treatment as preserving natural history. When families complained, the system took their pain apart and fed it into process and intake a form, a reply that thanked them for their perspective. Disagreement was neutralized by translation. Selective transparency also did its work. Portions of protocols were shared to demonstrate candor, while the decisive memos stayed in internal files. When scandals flared, institutions promised reviews that focused on the past tense. What happened avoid the present urgent? What is to be done now, for whom and by whom supervised? Erasure, in this sense, is not an event. It is a habit. Did it keep repeating? Not as a replica, but as a rhythm. Wherever access is scarce, consent is coerced by need. Wherever metrics outrun ethics, sample integrity outruns human integrity. Wherever racism rationalizes shortcuts, the unspeakable dresses in new language. The point is not that every study is Tuskegee. The point is that Tuskegee reveals what becomes possible when the guardrails are declared too expensive. Answering the title's why requires naming responsibility. Individuals made choices. Institutions configured incentives. A nation tolerated a hierarchy of suffering. Accountability must therefore be structural. Apologies matter. Funds matter. Memorials matter. But the repair test is concrete. Do communities most harmed govern the research that touches their bodies? Are consent processes funded to be slow enough for understanding? Do protocols treat cure as a duty rather than a variable? And when discrepancies appear between what is promised and what is practiced, who holds the keys to the cabinet? Finally, the mechanism of forgetting must be broken. History classes must teach not only the noun Tuskegee, but the verbs deferred, redirected, renewed, euphemized. Ethics boards must read not only principles, but case files line by line, until the administrative voice cannot hide intent. Public health must recruit trust, not with posters, but with power sharing. Otherwise, we will mistake exposure for closure and continue to live in the long echo of macabre paperwork. The act closes with the cabinet still open. The papers have been read. The pattern is named. What remains is not a sensational twist, but a civic assignment to build systems where non-therapeutic can never again be a shield, where disturbing decisions cannot hide in tidy fonts, and where families see in the clinic not an instrument, but a neighbor. In the next act, we will follow the echo, how this legacy shapes care decades later, and what it means to turn banned truth into shared protection. The study ended on paper long before it ended in people. In 1972, exposure forced a stop. In the years that followed, rules and principles were written to promise a different future. But in Macon County, trust kept its own calendar. Families measured time not by headlines, but by habits: who avoided clinics, who kept questions unasked, who folded free into beware. Apologies mattered, and funds mattered. But repair lived in smaller rooms, a consent form, read slowly, not hurried. A nurse hired from the block, not just the brochure. A community meeting held before the protocol was final, not after. Ethics became architecture transportation stipends that removed coercion by need translation, that turned jargon back into plain speech advisory boards with real votes rather than ceremonial chairs. The lesson hardened into practice. If your study cannot survive full and plain explanation to the people it touches, it should not survive. The legacy is vigilance without spectacle. Black physicians, nurses, organizers, and scholars rewrote the workflow budget for time, not just tests. Count who declines and why. Treat cure as duty, not variable. In classrooms, students learned the verbs of harm, deferred, redirected, renewed, euphemized, and the counter-verbs of repair, informed, treated, shared, accountable. A clinic sign summed it up. Your questions are part of care. In that sentence, trust began to return. The cabinet is open now. It cannot be made secret again. But access is not absolution. Memory without motion is only a museum. The charge is procedural and human at once. If you write protocols, fund the slow parts listening translation. Teach back because that is where consent becomes real. If you hold budgets, price dignity into the line items. If you work at the bedside, let a patient's pause be a tool, not an obstacle. If you lead institutions, put the most affected communities in the voting seats and publish what changes when they say no. For families and patients, your questions are not interruptions. They are instruments. Ask to see the words that will govern your choice. Ask who benefits if you say yes, and who protects you if you do not. Truth that cannot sit plainly in a small room is not truth you owe your body. For storytellers, including us, the ethic is clarity without spectacle. We refuse graphic images. We follow the paperwork where it leads. The macabre part was always administrative calendars that outlasted conscience-tidy fonts that steadied immoral hands. Keeping the cabinet open is the work so students, clinicians, and neighbors can read a line and hear the siren inside the softest words. Tuskegee does not end with a headline. It ends with a pen above a form and a question answered in plain language. If the men of Macon County would recognize respect in this room, do they keep going? If not, keep working until policy chooses people over purity of data, until science speaks plainly, until doors stay open on cabinets and exam rooms alike. History still haunts the land. Let it haunt us toward honesty, not fear.